Horror is a genre full of terrifying monsters. But for as long as I can remember, there was one monster that scared me more than all the rest.
Oh my god.
Zombies. I don't remember which movie exposed me to my very first zombie, but almost all my nightmares growing up revolved around Romero's iconic monsters. But recently it seems that zombies have taken a back seat when it comes to horror. Not to say that there's a shortage of the undead in modern media in general, but it surprised me when I realised that my favourite zombie shows and movies were almost all comedies. Aren't zombies meant to be, you know, scary? It's the nature of pop culture that basically every monster gets defanged at some point, with vampires being an obvious victim.
This is what I am.
What made zombies so terrifying in the first place? Sure, getting eaten alive is probably one of the most horrifying things you can imagine. Zombies play on a very primal fear of disease and death and should, by their nature, make us uncomfortable. Notice how there's always a zombie virus or infection, words that deliberately evoke the idea of plague. For most of us, the idea of seeing all the blood and guts and bones and whatever that black stuff is beneath our skin makes our stomachs churn. It's why gore is one of the most well-trodden scare effects in horror. So what's more repulsive than watching someone walk around with their guts hanging out? A decaying zombie visually reflects our fears of our immortality, a glimpse as to what happens when time has its way with us. Zombie media also suggests, intentionally or otherwise, that our society is so fragile that all it takes is a little brain munching to topple everything and reduce us to savages. Romero's iconic Dawn of the Dead brought up the connection to modern consumerism.
That we are the walking dead.
At the end of the day, there's just no outliving the undead, at least within these stories. They're an enduring horror, one that supposedly never tires or weakens, never gets bored. You may have found some place that feels safe, but nope. Them zombies always get through, the walls always fall, or some asshole brings them down. It will never just blow over. That's why zombies should be, and often were, scary. But when it comes down to it, they just aren't. At least not as much as they should be. Despite the visual terror they should inspire, the idea of a zombie being a threat, in reality, is laughable. They're slow, stupid, they melt in the heat and freeze in the snow. You can outrun them, so just avoid cornering yourself. You could go for the challenging headshot, or you could just break their legs and then stamp on them at your leisure. Mystery is scary, and zombies have way too many rules that too many stories rely on now. Romero's zombies worked because they were different to what came before. They barely had anything in common with the original Haitian folklore. Like all good monsters, zombies originally had something to say about the human psyche. The problem here is that dead people have no personality or character, so humans always end up being the most interesting parts. But sometimes zombies can actually make great main characters, despite being dead. In iZombie, Liv Moore is a recently but only mostly deceased, who must eat brains regularly to avoid going full Romero. Brains that then cause us to take on personality traits of the deceased, and visions of how they died.
It will pass. She just needs to eat someone else's brain.
Is that all?
The show is primarily a murder mystery comedy, but iZombie urges us to connect to the titular monster. The unique setup of taking on a different brain every episode is great for comedy.
It isn't funny.
But it's also a creative way to dig into different parts of the character when desired. In the Flesh was much less of a comedy, but it similarly urged us to empathise with the so-called monsters, who in this case have been returned to almost human. Here, In the Flesh used these characters as a stand-in for people who are seen as different, who are shunned and treated with contempt. In these scenarios, zombies make a more effective storytelling tool than they do as actual stories themselves. Admittedly, becoming part of the background risks them becoming nothing more than faceless ragdolls to be killed for entertainment, turning horror movies into action movies. But then there are the movies that remind us why horror is still possible, such as 28 Days Later. Director Danny Boyle's monsters may not be zombies in the traditional Romero sense, but that's a huge benefit for the movie. The infected are fast, and it only takes a drop of blood to become one of them. This fear is just as terrifying as the monsters themselves. Boyle keeps them out of view as much as possible, using the empty views of London to chilling effect. Although not strictly zombie, the Will Smith-led I Am Legend used the same technique, relying on emptiness to build the horror instead. I feel like I need to mention one more factor. Zombies are really easy to make. I say this as an amateur low-budget filmmaker myself, but the unfortunate side effect here is that they get reduced to a bit of a joke, as it's very hard to make a low-budget horror that isn't also funny. That's how we ended up with Z Nation, made by the same company that gave us Sharknado. At first it appeared as just another Walking Dead parody, about as low budget as they come, but it somehow becomes something I really enjoy. Zombies in the history and pop culture are integral to why the show works as well as it does, and so it embraces all the movie tropes that we've come to recognise. Watching Z Nation is like taking a blood-splattered walk through B-movie history.
It's the apocalypse. Let's have some fun.
But despite having all the fun in the world with the premise, it doesn't sacrifice character or story for its silliness.
Cheer up, 10K. Put our brothers out of my misery.
The main cast have been just as developed as any you'd see on a more serious show. So it's seeming more and more that zombies work best when paired with comedy. You have iZombie and Z Nation obviously, but you also have the Drew Barrymore-led Santa Clarita Diet, which plays like Dexter meets Modern Family. Two of my favourite zombie movies are naturally Zombieland and Shaun of the Dead. Both are hilarious and frankly great movies all around, with endearing characters who undergo proper developed arcs. But impressively, they also manage to keep the zombies scary when required. To me, this is because these movies aren't designed to scare. The zombies are just there to push the characters in the story and often to provide humour, and we're given time to bond with the characters we would in any normal movie. So then when a director decides to make them an actual threat, it stands out and has all the more impact. In the end, everything else aside, they're great stories. The zombies are just part of the story, and they serve it as much as any other part of it does. As we've seen, they offer up a lot in the way of story. They can be funny, or they can say something about people and society. But scary? Only sometimes.